Johnson. I am the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at the Hartford, and I'm also a proud board member of the National African American Insurance Association, and I also chair our program committee. And our programming committee is delighted to present this meeting today in honor of Black History Month. And I just want to welcome you all. We're all getting settled. We're going to start with a few housekeeping items for our webinar.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. I'm going to share slides with you so that we can give you a little bit of housekeeping on this webinar platform. Your view should have some of these buttons that I'm showing you. On the bottom left-hand side are your audio settings. You control all your settings. If you need to turn it up, down, or handle your settings. If you have any problems with your computer audio, we recommend calling in with the phone audio for more stability. You're able to raise your hand for the question as well. At individually if needed. Q&A will be handled at the end of the, to your right-hand corner, you're able to control how you view the presenters. You can view one screen, multiple screens, or no screen if you want to see the presentation fully without a picture of the presenter. So all the controls are in your hands. You are muted, so you will not be able to be heard, but you can hit the Q&A to ask any questions and chat as well. Those are the housekeeping.
Thanks, Jephthah. Now we're going to jump right into our session with Joelle Murchison, and I'm excited to introduce Joelle to you. She's a longtime friend and a trusted colleague in this world of diversity and inclusion. And by way of background, Joelle is an accomplished executive. She's worked in university settings. She's been a diversity and inclusion champion, and she also is the mother of 4 beautiful children. She does a great job of balancing her career, her family, and a very active community and volunteer schedule. Joelle is a graduate of Brown University, as well as the Harvard Graduate School of Education, University School of Communications, and she does a great job of combining her passion and interests in education, equity and inclusion, policy, and communications in her work. She's currently the founder and principal of Exec Mommy Group, which is an inclusion, communication, leadership, and coaching consulting practice. Prior to that, she started her career in higher education at Wesleyan University and spent some time in the not-for-profit sector with the Inroads organization. And then she transitioned to corporate America with United Technologies, and she was also the inaugural Chief Diversity Officer at Travelers Insurance, which is where she became a friend of NAAIA. She's been to several of our conferences and has been the speaker at NAAIA conferences. In 2016, Joelle returned to higher education as the first Chief Diversity Officer at the University of Connecticut, where she currently serves as an adjunct faculty member at the University of Connecticut School of Business. She's a recipient of many awards and accolades in the community. She's very involved in her church and other community organizations. And at her core, Joelle is passionate about encouraging and inspiring all people to reach their highest potential and to create space for open dialogue. I think you'll get a glimpse of that today as she takes us through her very special presentation specifically for NAAIA's recognition of Black History Month. I'll turn it over to Joelle.
Thank you so much, Susan. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully this will work. Okay. All right, well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join us for this really important webinar. It feels like returning home in having the opportunity to connect with all of my NAAIA friends across the country. Having served almost 10 years as the Chief Diversity Officer at Travelers, NAAIA feels like a part of family for me. So thank you, Susan, and all of the programming committee for your invitation to be with you today. Today I want to just share briefly with you, hopefully some words to cause you to think a bit and to cause you to be inspired as we attempt to navigate the challenging climate that we exist in, but also at the same time remain optimistic about our possibilities and opportunities as career professionals. So I'm going to talk to you today about a topic that I developed a couple of years ago in the midst of the situation just after the shootings of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile, and on the heels of the Charlottesville incident. We have been, I would argue, from that period of time in a really interesting climate for a variety of reasons. And it really brought me back to thinking about the time just prior to me entering high school and college, where we also were dealing with some pretty interesting times in our society. And it always reminds me of some of the modern day griot that we had through hip hop music that talked to our communities about things that we needed to do and how we needed to structure ourselves with real positivity around our self-identity, but also calling upon our community to be more responsible. So I had to share these with you. For any of you out there who are Gen Xers, you will remember the Stop the Violence movement, BDP, and a number of other hip-hop artists, and the song Self-Destruction, really calling us into some responsibility for what we need to do to move forward, thinking about the importance of our identity as we reflect on artists like Public Enemy and X-Clan, really bringing us into a space where we could really shout that we were proud to be Black or African American in the midst of challenging times. And it reminds me of our shouts of the red, the black, and the green, and really focusing on the Pan-African flag and what that meant to us as a community. And so that always leads me to think about school days. Now, of course, there's been a lot of dialogue around HBCUs as of late. There was a documentary, Tell Them We Are Rising, and there's been a lot of emphasis on the ability to thrive for our HBCUs. And so School Days was one of those movies that I'm sure has probably been shown about 15 million times this month over Black History Month to remind us of those times. And there's a moment in School Days that has always stuck with me, and that is when the character Dap, who you see on the screen, literally wrestles with the fact that students on campus are so absorbed with infighting and some of the maybe not so important issues of the day, and he's really encouraging students to come together and really look at what's happening around us. And I think that we need a modern day DAP because there are quite a number of issues that we are wrestling with within our community that have prevented us really from coming together. And so what DAP does is he walks out to the center of campus, for those of you who remember the School Days movie, this scene in particular, and he screams at dawn, "Wake up!" It's his call to action for our generation to suggest that there are so many other things that are distracting us from the issues at hand that we need to wake up. Proverbially, we need to open our eyes to identify what is happening. I think about that scene a lot as I think about the issues that our country is confronting today. Though they may not be very different from the time of School Days or even 2 decades before then during the Civil Rights Movement, it seems that we are in a place where we need, in fact, to wake up. And so as we are called to action in this time, I think about the phrase that I would like to challenge you all with as we think about our journey today that you've probably heard at some point in your life. And while that said we should wake up, today we talk about staying woke. Staying woke is a colloquial saying of that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with. It is absolutely not the correct conjugation of the verb for those who are the grammarians on the phone, on the webinar. In fact, to be accurate, we would say one should stay awake. However, in our diaspora, woke has become synonymous with being awake. And some of us may remember grandmama saying or our parents saying, is she woke? Is she awake? That's what we mean, right? And so I'm asking all of you to think about today, in a deeper sense, our opportunity to stay woke. I think we've got to be ever vigilant in this time. It is an opportunity for us to pay attention to important facts and issues, as the definition on the screen says. And it's time for us to approach this day and what's ahead, not only in the context of social justice issues or political issues as it relates to our society, but also in the context of our own responsibility as we move and navigate through our professional careers. As men and women of color, it is important and critical that we stay woke. We have to be alert of our surroundings. It is important for us to be clear and understand the operations of our organizations that we work within. We need to understand their operating practices, the expectations that they have of us, and also how our ability to be successful impacts the whole. This quote in particular from an article that was posted by Oprah magazine really captures some of the challenge that we wrestle with today. It says, in recent years, social consciousness has moved into the public arena, and I would argue the workplace as well, as outrage constantly fills our timelines and feeds. It's often easy to feel woke when we join the screaming masses, but what happens when we step away from our screens? How do we take all the awareness we've gained and turn it into concrete action, especially when the list of injustices grows by the day? It's like trying to stay awake when you're exhausted. Eventually, keeping your eyes open becomes too much. I remember a time when I was 8, and my aunt took my cousin and I to what used to be a Black-owned lodge upstate New York. And it was intended to be an opportunity for us at 10 and 12 to stay up late. And I remember how painful it became for me to keep my eyes open, that it simply was easier to just allow them to close and allow my body to settle into a place of comfort, not being alert to my surroundings. And of course, my aunt expected that as kids, we would be excited about staying up, that we would want to be alert so that we could see all the happenings. But in reality, my body just wanted to give in, just to be more comfortable. And that's what happens to a lot of us as well. The pressure, the pain of staying woke is sometimes more than we can bear. And so what happens then is then we have to go to work. We have to go to work and we have to figure out how to put on that face, that mask that allows us to deal with the issues that might be challenging to us that face us literally from the moment we awake, literally from the moment we pick up our phone. How do we then go to work and move all of those things out of our minds, move all of those things out of our consciousness to be able to be productive and effective? The external environment has a significant impact on us. Social media is right there as soon as we wake up in the morning. Some of us sleep with our phones so close to us. We use the alarms, and so the first thing that we do when we awake is we check our cell phone. There's a 24-hour news cycle from every possible vantage point, whether you are an MSNBC watcher, a Fox News watcher, Al Jazeera, BBC, CNN, it's everywhere. You can download the app and get alerts that will tell you what is going on up to the moment, both here in the United States and certainly across the world. And so the challenge is that the messages that we hear literally from the moment that we wake up is that this society is probably more polarized than it has been in a very long time. You are forced to make a choice, a decision. What side will you be on? Whether it's a political choice, whether it is a societal choice. Who will you believe? Who will you stand with? And oftentimes, those polar sides are evident within the context of the workplace. I'm really grateful for the work that Mary Frances Winters did in her book, We Can't Talk About That at Work, because it really positions for us the notion of the elephant in the room. All of those issues that we walk in the door with that are pervasive and around us from the moment that we wake up, that might be really present for us, quite frankly, even in our being transported to work, whether in our own cars or whether we're in public transportation, those issues are very much in our face. And yet we come into the workplace and we are expected largely not to show the effects of that trauma, because it really is, in the context of the workplace. And yet, in the workplace, and I've had the opportunity to, and a number of my colleagues on this call, like Susan, are asked to help workplaces and organizations become more equitable, to begin to look at some of the issues and how they impact our work, and most importantly to the organization, their bottom line, quite frankly, and the impact to stakeholders. And so one of the pieces in the book is a survey that the Winters Group did around race in the workplace. And what was most interesting to me as it relates to polar opposites is that 6 in 10 whites answered that they think their organization understands the unique experiences of Blacks in the workplace. In direct contrast, 6 in 10 Blacks answered that they did not think that their organization understands their unique experiences. Two groups of individuals, same survey, same workplace, very different responses. There was also a recent poll that showed that 56% of Americans feel that Muslim values are at odds with U.S. values. However, only 68% of those surveyed said that they had never or seldom talked to a Muslim. 68% said they had never or seldom talked to a Muslim. And so we haven't necessarily had exposure, but yet we seem to think we know what the values are, and most importantly, that they are at odds with our own. And finally, in a Pew survey on gender equity, 56% of men said that obstacles inhibiting women's progress are largely gone, but only 34% of women had the same view. It is very clear that we live in polar opposites, and that although we exist in the same society, some of groups within our society see things in very different ways. Here's just another example from Mary Frances Winter's book. She talks a lot about, in the book, the notion of the impact of trauma in the workplace as a result of the racialized society that we live in. A couple of statements from different employees in the context of the organizations that she surveyed. One employee referenced, "Our company sent out a statement after the Pulse nightclub shooting, but said nothing about the killings of unarmed Black men. Why does one group seem to deserve acknowledgement and sympathy, and yet our group, African Americans, does not?" Another leader, a white senior leader in a nonprofit organization, said, "I've not been affected by these events at all," presumably talking about the impact of racial trauma in the United States. "I could not have imagined the impact that it's having on you. It's shocking to me that you are fearful based on who you are." Again, a reality that many individuals face, but yet their colleagues in the same organization seem to have no idea of that impact. And then finally, I was at work and got a call from my child at school. He was terrified because the kids were telling him that he was going to be deported. I felt the need to leave and go get him. My boss understood. And here you see an example of a leader who understands and recognizes, though they may not face the same challenges themselves, the real trauma and challenge faced by individuals who are expected to walk into a workplace and seemingly take off the cloak of racialized society and leave it outside the door. We clearly live in a polarized society. But why does talking about any of this matter? Surely because the external environment has significant impact on the internal environment. And as a result, we collectively must stay woke. Now, there's a song, and I'm a big fan of music, that says experience is a good teacher. And so what we know to be true is that it is our experiences that have framed what we know about the world today. Our experiences are the conscious events that make up our lives, the events that make up the conscious path of a community, nation, or humankind. Generally, these are the definitions of experience. Direct observations of or participation in events as a basis of knowledge. So it is those things that we have had experience with or that we've been exposed to that frame and shape what we know. And that certainly is an explanation for why there are leaders in an organization who are not aware of the kinds of implications that the external environment does in fact have on us in the workplace. Our consciousness can be described as the things that we're aware of, observation, the things that we can see, and they both define our experiences, sometimes even unconsciously. Being conscious, however, is synonymous with being awake. And so throughout the experiences that we have in our lives, including in the workplace, we must stay woke, stay conscious, alert, and intentional not just about those external factors, but also about the internal and your career development. So I created this concept of staying woke connected to professional development, as I mentioned earlier, a couple of years ago, on the heels of the tragically complicated summer of 2016. And so staying woke in this context means winning opportunities through knowledge and experience. So leveraging the experience that we've had, gaining additional knowledge, and allowing that to create opportunity for us to win in the midst of all of the things that challenge us that are around us. And so when you think about career, it's important to define what we mean. The dictionary would define career as an occupation undertaken for a significant period of a person's life and with opportunities for progress. Career as a verb says to move swiftly and in an uncontrolled way in a specific direction. And so the interesting thing is that for a long time, we've defined career, particularly career development and advancement, as a very linear process. There's a ladder that we were expected to climb. And we all were taught that it was pretty linear. You went from one rung of the ladder to the next. I would argue that our careers today probably look a little bit more like the picture on the bottom. You might be moving in a clear direction, upward, maybe take a little bit of a detour out to a place where you didn't expect to be, but you're still moving forward in some way, but just a little bit more of a linear pattern than you would have anticipated. And so in the context of that, as we reflect around our career, in the context of Black History Month, as we hear around us and we celebrate around us all of the accomplishments that individuals have made who are of African descent, particularly on the United States, and we celebrate many firsts continually in this time, it's important for you also to stop and reflect on the accomplishments that you've made thus far. Which are you most proud of? And what were the steps that were critical to making them happen? As you begin to think about where you will go, it is critically important to think about where you have been. And how might you be able to even leverage NAAIA and the relationships that you've developed to help move your career forward? Now, what we do know is that there are barriers that stall career development. Similarly, as we think about the whole notion of the elephant in the room and the opportunities to talk about racial challenges within the workplace, there are barriers that exist there as well. Some of the barriers around career development we know have the ability to literally stop people in their tracks. Some of them have to do with lack of cultural understanding, and I would describe that as not only cultural in the sense of racial, ethnic, or the things that define who you are, but also in the context of organizational culture and not taking the time or having someone help you to navigate and understand the culture of each organization, because each and every organization, even departments within organization, are quite different. We know that bias and discrimination absolutely are barriers that could potentially stand in the way of career development, simply because many individuals still believe that there are only certain levels that we, as people of color, and particularly as Black and African American individuals, can only achieve to a certain level. But I want to just spend a little bit of time on two areas that act as barriers directly connected to bias that impacts us both externally and internally: imposter syndrome and stereotype threats. We'll start with imposter syndrome because this is something that we do to ourselves. It's a psychological term that talks about a pattern of behavior where we doubt our own capabilities. It's internalized fear of being perceived to be a fraud. In spite of all the accomplishments you've had, the degrees you've received, the experiences that you've had within your organization, somehow you don't believe that you're good enough and that you shouldn't necessarily be in the place that you are. The real challenge around imposter syndrome is that it trickles out from being just an internal belief, and it has significant impact on your performance. So when you believe that you are not good enough, or that you have a fear that someone will expose you for not having the information that you actually know that you have, it can actually negatively impact your performance. On the flip side, there's stereotype threat. And that's the expectation of the fear that you would be judged based upon a negative stereotype. So when individuals in the organization have limited exposure to people like you, they may decide that there's a particular stereotype that would render you not the right person to take on a role or to be able to accomplish a project, not because of your own capability or what you've demonstrated thus far, but simply based on a stereotype about a group that you've been assigned to. This, too, has an impact on your performance and even your ability to access opportunity. Excuse me. The three things that we can do about stereotype threat, unfortunately, how it manifests in many instances for us is overcompensation, doing a little bit too much. You know, sometimes we talk about, and there's research that demonstrates that people of color often over-degree. So we go back to school and we get every possible designation or credential that there is because we think somehow that it is those things that is going to allow us to propel into our next opportunity. That may be the case in some organizations, but again, back to understanding organizational culture, it's important for you to know that before you decide that you're going to go get that MBA or do that online program and then only become frustrated when it does not immediately indicate movement in your organization. Sometimes the result is we get discouraged. And we all know that being discouraged in the workplace is not a good thing. For those of us who are in human resources or human capital, we know that the larger percent of employees tend to be sort of those disaffected. You're discouraged, you come to work, but you're not necessarily interested in putting forth discretionary effort. And so that does not necessarily lend to high performance. The third response, and the one that I'm hoping that you all will take from today's talk, is around resiliency. Now, certainly in Black History Month, we can all point to many, many examples of people of color and particularly people of African descent demonstrating resiliency. And so with that, I say you have it in you. It's in your DNA. And so the reality is, how do you apply resiliency in a situation where the external environment is telling you everything that would not support your ability to be successful or to grow? And then you've got some internal messages inside of you that might be telling you that this is not the place for you. Here's where you find your resilience. And so I want to share a couple of requirements for staying woke. It is important for us to know who we are. And I think that goes without saying. I have never thought it to be more important than as I think about raising my children and them not having an opportunity, quite frankly, within the public school system to learn about themselves, to learn Black history. So how do you make sure that you know who you are, where you've come from? Also, what are the values that you stand for? What is important to you? How important is integrity? Do your values match with those values that are espoused within the organization that you work for? How do you also advance those values? Are you involved in activities in the community? What is it that you're doing that allows you to express who you are? The second requirement for staying woke is to understand your past. Take stock of the accomplishments that you've made and where you are now, and understand very clearly that what got you here may not be what gets you there. So how do you leverage your network and make the decision to say, I am ready to step into a new opportunity and I want to leverage my knowledge and experiences to win? Third, decide where you want to go. It is critically important to set goals. People come to me on a regular basis, particularly in my coaching work now, and they say that they want to make a change. The challenge is often they don't know how, and they don't know where they want to go, and they're not really clear about when. And so there are some things that you need to spend some time really talking with yourself about what it is that you want to do. What are the goals that you want to set? And what is required for you to achieve them? Might you need additional resources than you have today? Who should you connect with that will help you to develop the toolkit, if you will, that you will need to be successful? The fourth requirement for staying woke is to be ready, to literally be awake, thinking about your surroundings, acknowledging the culture of your organization, understanding what are the tools that will allow you to be successful within the organization. What are some potential pitfalls? Your employee resource groups will be great opportunities to begin to share information about what's important to understand about the culture of the organization. Stay up to date on the news. I know it's much easier to close our eyes and get comfortable, but we do need to know what is going on. I would argue that not only do we need to read news that comes from the perspective that we agree with, but we need to read news from perspectives that may be different. It's important for us to understand everything that is around us and also to engage in continuous learning. I would love to read more than I currently do. I don't have as much time as I would like, but I do think that it's important for us to find ways, whether through reading books, attending workshops, looking at a quick magazine, or even having a conversation with a colleague to ensure that you are up to date in everything that is happening, particularly in your area of discipline. And then finally, do 4 again. Watch and learn. Continue to watch and learn. Observe and stay alert. It's just that simple. It's really the only way that you will understand the rules of engagement in your organization and be able to set forth on the path to accomplish the opportunities that are in front of you. It's your opportunity to blaze your path. The way for you to win opportunities through knowledge and experience is to not be discouraged, to stay focused in spite of the challenges that are around us, to find ways to move forward that allow you to be authentically who you are, to celebrate the history, the rich history that you come from, while at the same time leveraging and taking full advantage of all of that history and experience that you bring as it relates to finding opportunities that will work for you. And so at this point in time, I am happy to entertain any questions that you might have about the concept of staying woke, the way that you can clearly focus on your career development in spite of the challenges that we face in this very challenging climate that we live in, as well as any other thoughts that you might have about this topic. Any questions?
Thanks, Joelle. We're going to have the Q&A session, and I'll just invite Jephthah to help with any moderated questions that we need to receive from the line. Again, for those of you who joined late, thank you for joining the NAAIA, National African American Insurance Association Black History Month celebration featuring Joelle Murchison.
I think, do I need to stop sharing my screen so that I can see if there are questions? I may have to. Is that the case, Jephthah?
Sorry, I muted myself. There have not been any questions.
Okay.
While the questions queue up, Joelle, I just wanted to reflect on something that your comments made me think about when you were talking about the awareness in the work environment and the stereotypes and the imposter syndrome. And I think about just that constant impact of microaggressions or feelings of kind of being the only one, and the phrase that is attributed to that, the emotional tax that causes people to feel. Can you just talk about the emotional tax, just to sort of reassure people that they may not be the only ones to feel that constant pressure?
Sure, absolutely. There were many times over my career where younger professionals would ask, so how do you do it? How do you remain authentically true to yourself, right? But also, sort of demonstrate and become a part of the organization. And I think emotional tax falls squarely into the mix of that. What do you do to keep yourself whole? Now, we hear folks talking about self-care all the time, and I think, it gets reduced to, go get a massage, go get, a mani or a pedi, but it's really much deeper than that. And I think it means that you have to find opportunities to protect your health in the context of the organization. We need to make sure that we connect with one another. NAAIA is the perfect opportunity to do that, certainly within your local chapters, but also I would suspect that many of the members of the employee resource groups in your organizations, if you're in a larger organization, may be members of NAAIA as well. And I think we have got to do better about telling our stories, sharing with one another, sort of that old adage, how we got over. Because I think the reality is that there are a number of us who have been through situations that have been challenging and have caused us significant emotional tax. And we do have a story to tell that would allow individuals to potentially use some tools to allow them to get through those situations with good health and also with some optimism towards their career. So do not stay in your bubble. Absolutely step outside of your bubble and ensure that you have individuals who you can trust, who you can have conversations with to help you identify solutions to the challenges you might be facing.
That's really helpful and insightful. I just trying to grab a couple of questions that are coming in. I see one, well, just some feedback that somebody feels this is very informative and given them some good food for thought. And then when you spoke of the imposter syndrome, what came to mind for this participant is this phrase, as a man thinks in his heart, so he is. And just another
absolutely. Just in terms of that perspective, I mean, many of us subscribe to the belief that we must speak unto ourselves in that same vein. And whatever it is that you need to ground yourself, to center yourself in the context of the workplace, many times I would have a quote behind my monitor that I could see directly, particularly if I'm sitting on a conference call, which we spend a lot of time doing. And sometimes your mind may wander. You may not be directly speaking on the call, but it's helpful to have affirmative messages around you that remind you why you're there. I love a bracelet that a friend gave me that says, remember why you started. Sometimes it's very challenging to not feel defeated in the context of particularly everything that's happening around us in our climate and in the workplace where we don't find ways to wrestle with those things so that we can move beyond and get the work done. You've got to find ways to encourage yourself and find mechanisms that you can use to provide you with constant affirmation in the context of your day.
Yeah, that feels really good. I see another question that came in that I hear often, and it's always an interesting conversation around people who struggle with being authentic and fitting in and sometimes covering in the work environment. Do you have a perspective around balancing being and showing up as your authentic self while also working within the constraints of the culture that you're in?
Yeah, I think that, oops, it looks like I'm muted. Am I muted? Okay.
No, we hear you fine.
Okay, good. I think that sometimes we can misunderstand what it means to be authentic. I think that's really the core of the issue. We have, and certainly within the Black community, but I think, really individuals in general have mastered what I always called the art of the flip mode, but it's absolutely, the ability to speak and carry ourselves and navigate within very different scenarios. And it may not necessarily be in racialized settings, but also, we have a different cadence when we speak to our friends versus the cadence that we utilize when we are on a webinar or when we're in a meeting. And so I think, again, to share another colloquialism, keeping it real, I think we have to make a distinction between keeping it real and being authentic. Being authentic is about exposing or espousing the views and the values that you have in everything that you do. So not making a decision that would put you in an ethical quandary, for example. Being authentic to the hairstyle that you choose to wear. Being authentic to the clothing that you choose to wear. But as I've always said to young professionals, in particular transitioning into the workplace, the work is what you're being measured on. And so I think that it's a lot harder when you have really accomplished the expectations, when you've met your goals. It's a lot harder for folks to be concerned about the way you demonstrate your authenticity when you've done what you've been asked to do. So I think there's really a balance there. You know, you don't always have to keep it so real. You should absolutely be authentic and true to who you are. But part of that means also upholding the responsibility that you committed to when you took the role. You told folks that you were going to do above and beyond. You told folks that you were going to accomplish your goals. And I think that's what's most important. And then it's hard to ask those questions around you being authentically you and what color you've dyed your hair, or whether you choose to wear it natural or, or straightened. Although, of course, we do know there's some environments where there's had to be legislation to cause that to be the case. But yeah, I think sometimes we get a little too caught up in trying to find the distinction. If you are authentically you, you're going to show up as you every single time, and people will expect that that's who you are, and your work will speak for itself.
That's great. What about, I see another question around handling favoritism in the workplace without being labeled angry or difficult. Maybe some strategies for people to assert their experience while also maintaining really good working relationships.
Yeah, I think one of the most important things we have to understand, just from the human nature perspective, is that, in the absence of knowing what someone's reason is for not liking you, excluding you, what have you, what we tend to do is we go to race or gender, whatever the characteristic is that we may have differently than that individual. And in some instances, that may be true. But what we have to be careful not to do is jump to conclusions that is in fact the case. And as humans, sometimes we just we don't connect with every person. People, from a cultural perspective, we have to recognize, I always share this example around eye contact, for example, that, in a very westernized society, in a very American-centric society, eye contact tells us, leaders in an organization, if you're interviewing candidates, eye contact tells us that we think people are engaged. Where it comes into issue is when we think about different cultural norms, and that there are some cultures where looking someone who is your senior directly in the eye is frowned upon, and it's actually even seen as disrespectful. So when you think about the notion of us being in the same workplace and yet expressing ourselves authentically, but not necessarily being received in the way that authenticity is being delivered, we all have opportunities to become more culturally competent. So let's try not to jump to conclusions about someone who may not be the most extroverted person, and you think it has something to do with you. Let's try to think about how we might interact with individuals that might find them or meet them where they are. So I always urge folks to be careful jumping to conclusions about what you think the reason is before you take some time to really examine your own cultural awareness, your own cultural biases, and where you have the opportunity to have an intentional conversation, ask the question so that there's no misunderstanding, but rather you're clear about what the individual's expectations are and even their feelings towards you, so that you don't make a misstep along the way.
Yeah, I think it's great to make sure, sort of test the waters a little bit, ask more probing questions and really understand what's happening. And I thought about that also when you were talking about your action steps for staying woke, knowing who you are and where you come from and where you're going, and then your notion about watching and learning. I thought about the opportunity that people should take to, yes, watch and learn, and also develop relationships with people with whom you can test your assumptions with.
Right.
A wide variety of relationships, I think, to really say, this is
Absolutely.
what do you think?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I would say, and there was another question also that asked about success factors, in a variety of different sectors and industries. For me, I think relationship building is at the core. And exactly to your point, Susan, in terms of having a core group of individuals, whether you refer to it as your board of directors or your mentor circle or whatever the case may be, that you can literally bounce ideas off of. Even some of the smallest things, it might be worth putting it past someone else just to test whether or not you are moving in the right direction. Sometimes we're hurt because of situations that have happened to us in previous settings, and we carry that hurt with us or those challenges with us. And so those are our immediate go-tos when something new happens in a new scenario. And so really kind of checking ourselves a bit with a trusted companion to help us, really think about, is that really what I heard? Is that really the best way to respond? Knowing what I know about the culture of this organization, what should my next step be? And I think it's critically important to really learn about the culture of places. I've worked in two corporate settings, one that was extremely collaborative, another that was extremely hierarchical. The way that I had to pivot, moving from one to another, was very, very significant. Was I successful in both places? Absolutely, because I took the time to make sure that I had individuals who I could get information and feedback from that would help me to make the right choices so as not to make missteps. Now, are we going to make missteps? Of course we are. How you recover from them is really the issue. And I know that someone will probably say, well, institutions have long memories, and people always say they'll never forget that, and as long as you stay. Well, that could be true. That's probably not the best and most mature way to lead, because we all grow through challenges. And there are probably senior leaders in your organization today who, if you knew them 30 years ago, you would have never expected that they would be sitting in the seat that they're sitting in today. So we've got to give each other a little bit of grace, I think. Don't be afraid to pull that young person to the side, or even your peer to the side, to say, I think here's something that would make what you presented even better. Right? Not to pull people down necessarily. You really made a mistake. That was terrible. But give people positive feedback that will allow them to course correct and be able to move forward in a positive fashion. So I think, there are a lot of challenges that we could face, but it's critical to have a cadre of individuals who you can seek feedback from and you can watch and learn from as well.
Yeah, that's really powerful. I like to point out to others when somebody's doing something that I really admire. So they get the credit, but they get that recognition, and then also we have a collective view on what good looks like.
Right.
I want to ask this question that reminds me of content that we have incorporated into our NAAIA National Conference. And let me just do a shameless plug for our 2020 conference, because the NAAIA National Conference this year starts on September 16th, and it's going to be down in beautiful Hollywood, Florida at the Diplomat Resort, and it's a fabulous place to have a conference. The content's going to be amazing, and the networking is going to be off the chain. So you have to please block your calendars now for September 16th to the 18th in Hollywood, Florida, right outside of Fort Lauderdale, because the NAAIA National Conference is going to be fabulous. And having said that, there's a question that came in around the differences for being woke between African American women and African American men in the business setting. And I wonder if you have a perspective on kind of how that added aspect around gender plays itself out for African Americans in the workplace.
Sure. It's interesting. I literally was having a conversation with a Black woman colleague yesterday about the notion of the angry Black woman. And having seen it played out, even ascribed to me, certainly in different instances when, we at times, whether male or female, are not given the permission to have emotion, right? And, we even tell each other sometimes, well, don't you cry in there or what have you. I've definitely had a teary moment or two in my corporate career. But I think that the challenge exists, I think, not more or less on one side, but certainly differently. And it's hard to make generalizations about gender norms these days, because I think that we can get caught up in hearkening to days gone by. But I do think that the way that culturally African Americans may share or our emotions, again, back to my comment about cultural competency, is just different than our European counterparts. And when you do work in cultural competency and you recognize, the differences in cultures and how different cultures interact with one another, when you think about, for example, the notion of the importance of breaking bread together, right, as a way to engender trust. Some of the more European context might be, well, let's go straight to the meeting and get the work done and close the deal. The relationship part might be missing, whereas it's something that for us culturally is really important. And so when you take all of that into the workplace, again, it really is a cry for the importance of watching and learning for all of us, males and females. There's not the angry Black woman adage for nothing, right? Someone has decided that when they see us behave in a certain way, they've categorized it in that fashion. I think that in many instances, Black males may present a physical challenge to individuals because what they believe to be true is based upon what they see in the media. So, we have to think about the images that are displayed, quite frankly, in the media that seek to represent who we are. And we can't forget that many of our colleagues who are not individuals of color may only for the first time have come into contact with people of color in an intentional way when they've met us. That is so real, particularly as I look at our students entering the university, coming from all across the place, who in most instances have only gone to school with peoples because of the way that our communities are so racially stratified. They largely have only gone to school with people who look just like them. And now you put them in the workplace, and they've largely only known people who look and act just like them. And so they get their cues and their information about who we are from the media, from social media, from TV. And this is not a cop-out and me trying to blame it, but if you think about if you've never met someone from a particular culture and your only representation of them has been something you've seen on Instagram, then you carry that over into the workplace. And this is what I'm talking about. The external really plays out in our internal environments as well. So I think that the challenges for us, males and females in the workplace, are really similar in their core. They may play out differently in terms of how women are expected to, the roles that women are expected to play. I think in the corporate setting, maybe a little bit different than the roles that Black men are expected to play in the corporate setting. And in many organizations, and I think this was the case in insurance when I was there still were many more doors opened for Black men because from a gender perspective, they were able to connect with white males who were in leadership. I think Black women really struggle because there's this expectation that white women are still not to be trusted. And so, in many instances, Black women remain guarded, whereas, men have had some access because of their gender to the echelons where women had not been. So I think it's a challenge. It continues to be pervasive for us, something that we have to be mindful of. But also, as I said, I think that we have to not forget that for many folks, they've not known us. They don't know us. They don't know us intentionally. And so their expectations are very different than who we are. And so every day we get a chance to show up and demonstrate who we authentically are and the value that we add.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And I know we're running out of time, so I just want to ask one final question, cognizant that we are at time. But, it might be great to leave the participants with your perspective on what progress has been made for African Americans in the corporate arena. What do you see as the upside, and where do you see progress having been made?
Well, I would say I think that there has been progress made in terms of access. We still have significant, I'm amazed every day when I see that we still are experiencing first in our society and in our workplaces, that we still are looking at, low single-digit numbers in representation of people of color, particularly Black men and women, as CEOs within the Fortune 500. So we know that we are there. We are in larger numbers and more junior levels within the organization. There's still significant opportunity as it relates to moving through into the leadership ranks. I do think we have to be much more intentional about grabbing our young people sooner, earlier. There are many niche fields, particularly within insurance, that in my experience, we'd look for someone who had 20 years of experience in inland marine. Well, the only way that you have that is if somebody introduced that to you very young. So we've got to make sure that we are introducing our young people to the various career opportunities that are available to them even sooner. I teach in a school of business, and the percentage of students who are African American in the school of business is abysmal. It takes students knowing that's the school they want to apply to before applying to college. And so if they're not thinking about that in high school, they're not going to apply, and therefore the pool never increases. So, I think we've made some progress, and particularly so that we can be seen, but we still have miles to go. I'm grateful for our ERGs and for NAAIA having grown to be the organization that it is in the 15 or so years that I've been familiar. The growth has been significant, and I think I would encourage everyone to keep doing what you're doing. Your visibility is important, and I think that's the way that we'll be able to continue to see the pipeline moving forward and see hopefully faster rates of growth over time.
Thanks, Joelle. Appreciate you. Thanks for sharing your
Thank
nuggets.
You.
And again, thanks to the NAAIA organization and this webinar on behalf of Black History Month. I will now turn the program over to our board chair, Mr. Ken Branch, to close us out.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you, Joelle. Just some absolutely outstanding comments today. Having spent 25 plus years in corporate leadership and the last 10 years in the officer space of a Fortune 100 company, some of your comments were, I thought, just absolutely spot on. And I hope folks took really copious notes, and because I think they were really, really great. Also, I was going to make a shameful plug for the conference that's going to be in Florida in September at the Diplomat in Hollywood, but Susan did a great job of doing that. So I'll just ask you guys to please mark your calendar.
That's beautiful.
I'll just ask you to be sure to mark your calendars. It's going to be an outstanding conference, and there'll be more leadership training and events just like this, hosted by our fabulous chair, Susan Johnson. So I want to thank all of you guys, and Joelle, on behalf of the NAAIA National Board and all of our chapter leaders, just want to thank you for your absolutely outstanding comments and your commitment to NAAIA. Thank you very much, and hope everyone has a blessed day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.